Good afternoon, everyone. I am Anna van Zoest. I am the director of the Netherlands Atlantic Association. And with me in the studio is Bob Deen. Bob is the head of the security unit at the Clingendael Institute and coordinator of the Clingendael Russia and Eastern Europe Center. And on the other side of the Atlantic, we are connected to Heather Conley. Heather is the sixth president of the German Marshall Fund since January 2022, and she previously worked for the Center for Strategic and International Studies as a senior vice president for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic. And she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the US State Department with responsibility for relations with Europe. And Heather, you are also the author of the report, A Modern Marshall Plan for Ukraine, 7 Lessons from History to Deliver Hope. And that's what we will be discussing today. And Heather and Bob, it's a pleasure and it's an honor to have you both with us today in what is a very important week for Ukraine, including a visit of President Zelensky to Washington, deliberations in Brussels later on this week on accession, on a new support package, decisions which will have a huge impact on Ukraine and on the Ukrainian people. In the midst of all this, and going back to the report, Heather, I would like to start with a quote from George Marshall, former U.S. Secretary of State and the founding father of the original Marshall Plan, who said in 1947 that it is logical for the United States that it should do whatever it is able to do to assist in the return of normal economic health in the world, without which there can be no political stability and no assured peace. And Heather, do you feel that this statement applies to the responsibility of the United States towards Ukraine, and how has it inspired your report?
Well, Anna, thank you so much. And Bob, as always, great to be with you. Thank you, first and foremost, for having this conversation. It's a conversation I think we have to have across the United States as well as in Europe of why this is so important. So if you'll give me a moment, I'm actually going to help shape the thinking of what was behind then Secretary of State Marshall's historic speech that outlined the European Recovery Plan or the Marshall Plan. And I want to emphasize, look, this, for the United States, the American people did not want to invest in the Marshall Plan when Marshall gave his speech. In fact, there was a lot of anger against it. It wasn't a well-noticed speech. And what had to happen is the Truman administration at senior levels go out across the country to convince the American people of why it was in America's interest to invest in Europe. So I think it comes back to what I call this 1947 to 1949 moment. So we're really having this incredible set of important 75th anniversaries. But I feel like it was the 20th century's generational inflection point where the United States had to decide whether it was going to remain externally engaged or, after exerting itself globally, it would come back home and return to isolationism, which we had certainly done after every sort of major foreign excursion. And that's what made the Marshall Plan so unique, because it was a decision to remain externally focused and to invest in our allies and partners so that the United States would not lose the gains that it had made in the Second World War. And of course, the enormous sacrifice that we all had and the devastation from that. But it was something that, again, the Marshall Plan was an investment in prosperity to protect democracy. And then a year and a half later, NATO was founded, and we needed a security umbrella to protect that. I feel like we're seeing in the 21st century with Ukraine the exact same pattern. But the question is, for the United States, will it make a decision to remain externally engaged, to ensure the gains that it has made to protect America's prosperity and security, or will it turn inward? So if we invest in Ukraine now, it will protect its democracy, eventually bringing Ukraine into NATO to ensure its security. That is an act of self-interest for the United States. I would argue for Europe. The Marshall Plan wasn't charity. It was a strategic investment. And we see 75 years later, who are our most important trading partners? Europe. Who are our most important security partners? Europe. That's the investment that paid off. But over the last 30 years, policymakers and political voices have only seen America's allies as a burden. You're not doing enough. It's a ripoff. It's free riding. And we have failed to underscore the benefits of that strategic investment. So we have to do this again and really explain the benefits to all of our citizens economically and from a security standpoint. Because if Ukraine is unsuccessful, you think we're paying a lot now, we are going to pay so much more in the future with more forces, less economic security. So this is what's at stake. But unfortunately, we're far behind in the communication of what's important, what's at stake, and what are the consequences if Ukraine is unsuccessful.
Thank you, Heather. And Bob, under the original Marshall Plan, the United States invested nearly $13 billion in the European economy. The Netherlands received about $1 billion, not an insignificant amount. You have a personal connection with the Marshall Aid. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, no, thank you. And also, Heather, indeed, good to see you again. And thank you for taking the time to speak with us about this important plan. Indeed, on a very personal note, my parents are currently living in a house that was built with American aid, with Marshall Aid, because a lot of investment was made in regions of the country that were not very prosperous, including in the field of agriculture. So a lot of farmhouses were built, a lot was invested in regions that needed it. So I think there's many Dutch that still very fondly remember this moment that the Americans were there for us. And while it wasn't charity as such, it was indeed a strategic investment by the United States. It doesn't mean that the gratitude wasn't enormous on this side of the Atlantic. And I think it went a long way to explain also U.S. soft power, not only hard power and also through NATO and the security guarantees that came with it, but also the fact that even after Europe was ruined by war, the Americans were there to help rebuild. So yes.
And you've read the report. You follow everything that happens in Ukraine very, very closely.
Yeah.
Does it make sense to talk now about rebuilding Ukraine whilst there's still so much fighting going on?
I have to say I felt a little bit in two minds about this because, of course, it's difficult to discuss to what extent the Marshall metaphor applies to the current situation. Of course, the two most important differences were, first, the Marshall Plan was after the war. It was indeed rebuilding after war, while now we need to discuss reconstruction during the war. We don't have the luxury of waiting until it's over. The second thing is the Marshall Plan included defeated West Germany. And now we're discussing a plan for of course, only Ukraine. Nobody wants to discuss the stabilizing Russia at this point. So there are two things that are really quite different. And I particularly need to focus on this first bit. As you mentioned, it's a really difficult week for Ukrainians, with the US aid being held up, the European aid, where they're still being discussed, with Hungary being very difficult. I think Ukrainians are focused now on the here and now. Can we get the luxury of actually fully defending our country and liberating it? But still, I fully agree with Heather. We do need to discuss what happens next. And it's very important, and that's why I like the title of the report as well, that there is some sort of light at the end of the tunnel for Ukrainians, that they know what they're moving towards. I think that is really important to do.
Thank you, Bob. And before we start talking about the situation today, Heather, how is this Marshall Plan different from the original?
Well, and thank you. There's a really important reason why we're really focusing on the Marshall Plan, because it is absolutely associated with one of the most successful foreign policy initiatives of the United States, exactly as Bob said. People say when there's a big idea, let's have a Marshall Plan. It is a positive connotation. Why I don't talk about reconstruction, and even there's political reasons of not to talk about reconstruction for the United States. Look, we've had failure in Afghanistan reconstruction, Iraq reconstruction. That's a connotation with failure. We have to make sure that we are, strongly associated with success. And I bring the history up because we were successful. We can do this again. So success builds on success. I would also say the German Marshall Fund, as our name suggests, absolutely has to be involved in this. We were founded 51 years ago by the German government to thank the American people for the Marshall Plan. So the German are our name. We're a U.S. organization. We are not a German organization. That always causes a little confusion. with the name, but it was an absolute act of gratitude, exactly as Bob said, because it was hard to imagine 2 years after defeating Nazi Germany, the United States turned around and invested in the rebuilding of West Germany at that moment. That in itself speaks volumes to the strategic nature of what the Marshall Plan was all about. Other differences, of course, the original Marshall Plan, it was one country, the United States, supporting and investing in 16 countries in Europe. The modern Marshall Plan for Ukraine is 50 plus countries supporting one country. Now that sets up a different challenge of coordination, of course, but this is not just one country's, it's not a burden, but it's not falling on any one country's shoulders. But we have, again, forgotten what we're trying to build. And as I said, this is our generation's greatest rebuilding project. And it's not that we're going to, Ukraine is not going to rebuild itself the way it was. It will be a modern Ukraine. And the one other historical item, we're not just having Ukraine recover, we are building markets. And that's why Ukraine's integration with the single market, closer connectivity to American markets, that's how Ukraine recovers. And thankfully, the Ukrainian private sector is vibrant. There is something that, we can help develop with technology and with support. So we have a lot of things working in our favor. The tragedy is our politics are working not in our favor. And just to connect, just as an observation, Prime Minister Viktor Orban's political director was in Washington earlier this week, consulting with far-right Republicans on how they were, aligning themselves on Ukraine. So there's some alignment here with like-minded entities that are clearly, for reasons unknown to me, pro-Russian. And at this point in the conflict, if you are pro-Russian, you are pro-Iranian, pro-North Korean, and pro-China, which is a very different foreign policy that I have understood certain elements of the Republican Party to support.
So this is a really important point you make, Heather, and you also state in the report that at the time that the original Marshall Plan was founded, there was an enormous amount of bipartisan support in Congress. The US public was very much behind this. And of course, we are now seeing in Washington a lot of polarization also around the issue of Ukraine, with the next support package of $65 billion currently being held up in Congress. We also see that public support levels are slacking somewhat. Are you concerned, Heather, about America's commitment to Ukraine and to European security in general?
So I have been very concerned, really, as we now are on the cusp of crossing the second year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion, that the Biden administration, while incredibly supportive of Ukraine and working closely with our allies, had not dedicated itself to speaking across the country, working with a variety of American communities to explain why this investment was so critical to America's prosperity and our security. And in absence of understanding why and the consequences of lack of success and the cost of those consequences, that left the playing field for those who either don't support it for their own reasons or want to see politically the administration fail. And so what the last few days here in Washington, what was very clear, and this was, President Zelensky did a valiant job being clear and focused on what was important. This stopped being about Ukraine. The conversation in Congress is about U.S. border security and the failures of decades of immigration reform, which they, the political parties are trying to foist some decisions on it. And of course, Ukraine, not only Ukraine and Israel, and even Taiwan are collateral damage to that domestic issue. And, clearly, President Zelensky understands the importance of border security. They have not been able to control their border with Russia since 2014. So it's not that they don't understand the importance of it. Obviously, it's a domestic conversation that they're not a part of. But this polarization now is harming U.S. national security. This is where, unfortunately, we cannot seem to be able to break out of our polarization and our political warfare to see the bigger picture and put America and America's national security first and foremost, rather than our partisanship. Certainly the border needs to be secure. No one disagrees with that. But there's collateral damage to how Congress is going about it. And unfortunately, I think President Biden, who again has been a stalwart, it just sounded like yesterday he was not to, like, maybe we can, as much as we can support Ukraine, we have to support Ukraine. Our national interests are tied up in it. So hopefully resolution will happen in the new year. It does not seem that Congress will act before they go on recess this week.
Well, I think we can be honest in saying that in Europe, we see this similar trend of Ukraine becoming increasingly a domestic policy issue, which comes with a dynamic of its own. Bob, could you reflect on this and the concerns you have in that regard?
No, absolutely. I think, as Heather was saying, of course, it's an overarching security interest that Ukraine doesn't lose this war, but it becomes a victim of political games and blackmail here as well, especially between Hungary and the rest of the European Union. Hungary effectively wants to be paid itself in order for the EU to be able to pay Ukraine. That's not how things should go, right? So what you see is that certain groups don't want to give the support to Ukraine, and they want something in return for giving it. That's not how this was supposed to go. But it is politics as usual in the end. And there are ways we can solve it. One good example would be the Dutch parliament. I know a lot of people in Ukraine were calling us. They were very worried about the outcome of the Dutch elections. But Dutch politics work in their own unique ways. There was a big parliamentary debate and a motion was adopted with broad parliamentary support to continue not only supporting Ukraine, but even calling on the Prime Minister to continue to be proactive at the European level, to keep asking and pushing for support for Ukraine. And the same happened in Poland, interestingly, where there was a government that was becoming more skeptical. And recently we see the new Polish government. So for every situation where Orban or Fico in Slovakia comes to power and starts blocking things, there's also other political forces that keep Ukraine on the agenda. So I can understand the extreme concern that now exists in Ukraine, especially because the US support on the military field is essential. The EU can't step in quickly enough. We can't produce enough artillery shells. The US is crucial still for that. But I'm confident that in the longer term, the EU can muster the resources, at least financially, to keep supporting Ukraine.
I also want to speak for a moment about NATO and EU integration of Ukraine. And the original Marshall Plan is interesting in this regard because at the time, the United States insisted on closer cooperation within Europe as a condition for the Marshall Aid. And then the Europeans and France, most notably in this respect, insisted on a US security guarantee, especially for what was then West Germany, which was then ultimately delivered through the creation of NATO. So the Marshall Plan ultimately helped to lay the basis of what would later become the European Union, as well as NATO. And I think that's interesting as we are considering the future of Ukraine today. And Bob, maybe this is also a moment to look ahead at the meeting of the European Council tomorrow in Brussels. What can we expect from that meeting?
Yeah, I wish I knew. I think the financial package will come through because also the EU countries found a way of working around Hungary in case it would block it. They could also do it in a more convoluted way with a series of bilateral grants or other intergovernmental solutions. I'm more concerned about the EU enlargement thing because we know that within EU context, there's a long track record of countries abusing this asymmetrical power relationship they have and actually blackmailing not only the country that wants to join the EU, but also the rest of the EU. And that's exactly what we see Hungary doing. In the case of Ukraine, they want concessions on not only the Hungarian minority, but also a bank and other things. In the case of the EU, they want more money. But it's also something more ideological increasingly. And I think what Heather pointed out, Orban going to the US, reaching out to Republicans, he's doing that across Europe as well. There's also a group growing that is just opposing what can we call it? The elite that wants certain things, right? And is putting it in a more polarized way. And that, I think EU enlargement will fall victim to that dynamic, I'm afraid. And on the side of the Netherlands is not in favor of a geopolitical choice to just enlarge the European Union, even if the countries are not ready. because I think we've also learned from a couple of other cases that then you are dealing with trouble after they've joined the European Union. So I think the EU enlargement, we need to be honest to Ukraine. That is going to take an extremely long time, not only because Ukraine needs to be ready, but also because the EU needs to be ready and to reform. So I'm afraid that on that front, the Ukrainians might get still a political signal that accession negotiations can be opened, but they should be in it for the long haul. It's a very long and transformative process, and no quick fixes.
That's a clear message. Heather, next year, another big NATO summit in Washington. We are coming out of the previous summit in Vilnius, Lithuania, where Ukraine very much hoped for a path towards NATO membership. What can we expect from next year's summit in Washington?
Thanks, Anna. And just to pull on Bob's comment on the European Union, again, just to go back to the original Marshall Plan, I'll just reemphasize this. It was not to help 16 countries recover and reconstruct. It was to create a single market. And you're absolutely right. It was the policy. Really, the Marshall Plan was the beginning impetus of the European Union and founding the single market in many respects. And I think we have to think about that as well. But having said that, Bob is absolutely right. Ukraine's membership in the European Union will transform the European Union as it understands itself in common agricultural policy, regional and cohesion funds. But that's what makes it geopolitical. And so this is the irony of that. Politically not ready, but will be the most important and consequential development is in its enlargement. So it's fascinating. But having said that, what we may see in the first time in enlargement is that the European Union may come before NATO. And usually NATO enlargement has always either precipitated or happened at the same time, thinking of the Big Bang enlargement in 2004 with Central and Eastern Europe. So we may have a point now where NATO isn't going to be the first one, or in combination, that the EU will take some steps. And I agree, these will be measures to at least integrate what they can integrate Ukraine in with absence of full membership. So at the Vilnius Summit, obviously that was a strategic communications complete failure related to the communique language on Ukraine. You had divisions within the alliance. Two countries, the United States and Germany, had opposed a more forward-leaning signal. And then, of course, you had the famous President Zelensky tweet en route to Vilnius that was certainly, again, a very divisive moment. I think we still have the exact same conditions as we head into Washington. The alliance is divided, but I believe the Ukrainian government understands that while they have submitted their request, the Ukrainian military will be one of the, if not the most capable European military through this and at the conclusion of this war, that NATO isn't yet ready for Ukraine. And what I'm hoping for the Washington summit is that there's just crisp, clear, forward-leaning language that continues to say and to make sure that no other country has a veto over this membership. And, you can't have a veto by the back door because we have leaders who are afraid. They are afraid that Ukraine's membership into NATO is a Putin red line that will go to nuclear conflict. That's a backdoor veto. And so it's just to make sure that all NATO members are ready to take this decision. It's a big decision, of course, but now you have, through the G7 security commitments, you have almost all of the NATO members providing their own form of bilateral security guarantees. Again, they're trying to find these creative workarounds. It is so difficult to do this. So, but I think everyone is mindful here. They do not want Vilnius Part 2. How do we agree to that language well in advance with the Ukrainian government to make sure there's a clear signal that no other country makes a decision other than the 31 members, hopefully 32 members of NATO when Sweden formally joins, and that we will not be deterred from this vision of bringing Ukraine into Euro-Atlantic security, into the Euro-Atlantic security architecture. Whether we can get there politically 4 days before the Republican National Convention, which is when the NATO summit will be held, this hyper politicizes NATO. And my emphasis for the next 9 months, and certainly GMF's emphasis, is to make sure that every American understands, whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, non-party affiliated, NATO is essential to every American's security. And there are costs to that security, but there are great benefits, and that we demonstrate that and not hyper-politicize where one presidential candidate will be for NATO and one potential presidential candidate will be against NATO. We have to avoid that, and that's what we're working very hard to do.
Thank you, and we'll get back to the topic of the U.S. elections later on, but maybe first a quick explainer, Bob. Heather mentioned the G7 security commitments that are in the making. What are these commitments?
It's a convoluted situation because it's what Ukraine needs in order to really end the war is a security guarantee that Russia will not just come back a couple of years later. That's, of course, everyone's fear. That's also what we learned about documents like the Budapest Memorandum, that even if you say we will guarantee Ukraine's territorial integrity, it doesn't actually mean much. So the G7 security commitments are one step below saying we will bring Ukraine into the alliance and Article 5 will apply. Why? Because there's a couple of things that NATO just doesn't want to do. What does it not want to do? It doesn't want to get divided. So now putting Ukraine's membership up for a decision would just divide NATO, because we know countries will block it. We don't want to give Russia the veto, because Heather is completely right. So we don't even want to give Putin the chance to divide the alliance over these things. But we also want to avoid a direct war with Russia. Not just a question of direct nuclear blackmail, as Heather rightly pointed out, but countries are concerned that if you bring a country that is in an active conflict into the alliance, you immediately become a party to that conflict, a full party. So this G7 security commitments are a way of countries saying to Ukraine, we will be there for you, but usually they are linked in one way or another to a point that I do unfortunately have to make after the war. And that is something that is missing. I noticed indeed in President Biden's speech, we will support you as long as we can. That is quite different from we will support you as long as it takes. And that always begs the question, as long as it takes what? Because I think that's a major difference between Second World War and the current situation. Then it was an all-out war, in which case the aggressor was fully defeated and occupied, actually. That is not an end of the war that we envision for this particular war. So it's going to be much more complicated to also give the American people, the European people, and the Ukrainian people a sense of how this ends, an honest sense of how this ends. And that is my concern with also the G7. There is no clear message on how this will conclude. The Ukrainians have a vision, that is a very clear vision, but the G7 is not fully behind reaching that outcome that Ukrainians want.
And all right, I'd like to give you a chance to react to that, but maybe also another question to reflect upon, and that is the upcoming presidential elections in the United States next year. Concerns in Europe about the future of the US security guarantee to Europe, the US commitment to NATO, especially if there were to be a change in the White House. Is there anything you can say to comfort us?
Oh, okay. You gave me a tall order on the comfort, but let me just a few reflections from Bob's important comments. I think we have to be extremely honest that the Allies do not have a common vision of what this ends, and this has been the problem from the very beginning. The Biden administration has been very clear, well, it hasn't been clear, but it has been, I think, very purposeful in saying that the assistance that the United States has provided is to put Ukraine in the best possible position to get to the negotiating table with Russia. The flaw with that is that there's never been a negotiating table to sit at, because this is now existential for both. Existential for Ukraine to survive as a nation, and now for Vladimir Putin's survival, his regime's survival. So that in itself was flawed, but you're exactly right. We don't have a vision. And this is where some voices in Washington, Republican voices, I understand, they don't understand what the strategy is. We'll continuing to invest is what is the goal here? What are we trying to achieve? And then that gets back to Bob's point of, to restore Ukraine's and territorial integrity to 1991 borders does mean the complete defeat of Russia in Ukraine. That's Crimea. That's, removal of these illegally annexed territories. And the fear, and you'll hear me use this word over and over again, afraid, afraid, afraid. We cannot be afraid that the fear of inflicting a defeat on Russia is too destabilizing. So we're basically seeking a more stable frozen conflict, but that's not the situation that we are going to have. So we do have a strategy problem, which does get back to the support for additional assistance. The one thing that President Zelensky has been asking for, well, two things. The Ukraine needs more air defense. We would never, ever ask U.S. military to go into a conflict without total air superiority. Yet the Ukrainians are fighting their counteroffensive without air support. This is tied to reconstruction. If you can't provide air defense, we just saw what happened in Kyiv last night. You have to be able, and that's where the security guarantee, at some point, you have to guarantee the Russian missiles can't keep destroying Ukraine. And increasingly using Iranian missiles, North Korean munitions, in addition to Russians. And the final point, I promise I will get to the U.S. election part, but this is really important on the way to the U.S. election. Red lines. It was a red line for Russia that Sweden and Finland to come into NATO. In some ways, these red lines, when they are met with clarity and with strength and conviction, I don't think Vladimir Putin wants to highlight a strategic failure. So I think we don't need to be, I don't mean to be provocative, but we have to be clear and show strength. And I often think we're self-deterring ourselves because Vladimir Putin leans into that because he knows a leader in the White House and other Europeans are afraid. He leans into that and we actually do his work for him. U.S. election. We don't know what's going to happen, 11 months from now. So history has told us every time, you can go back to every election cycle, that 11 months out, the person that was predicted to win, President Mitt Romney, nope, we have a lot of predictions. So we don't know anything right now. I think this is going to be a very volatile moment. We have two presumed candidates, President Biden and former President Trump, who right now the American people agree on one thing: they're not crazy about their choices. And so this is what makes it uncertain and very volatile. I think you will, as we go through our primary process, there may be some surprises that we don't foresee, third-party candidates. But it's too hard to predict right now. My message to our European colleagues are twofold. Number one, this isn't 2016. You will not be surprised. You will not be surprised if the former president returns back. Begin to prepare as best you can. That is strengthening your defense. That is strengthening your economy. You do that homework regardless of who's in the White House. That's really, really important. I also encourage all of our European partners and allies that the relationship with the United States is beyond the White House and beyond Washington. You have to get outside and work with states and governors and mayors and local leaders. We have to actually, I believe, rebuild the transatlantic relationship again from the bottom up to help people understand why it's an investment in our shared prosperity, our shared security. I think Americans don't acknowledge that Europe is our largest trading and investment partner because it's just part of us. We don't see it as different. We have to highlight the importance of this for every American citizen. I would argue the same thing has to happen in Europe. We have to rebuild this for a new generation. It took us 30 years to get to a point where an American president threatened to withdraw from NATO. We have to rebuild this for a new generation to understand this importance. That's on all of us with our friends, our neighbors, our family members that probably disagree with us very, very much on all of these issues. That's the work that must be done. That will not happen strictly in capitals. That happens outside, in rural areas, in agricultural communities. with a new generation that may not agree on the agenda that we believe is important.
Thank you. That's an incredibly important and powerful message. As we are coming to the end of this conversation, I would just like to go back once more to the original Marshall Plan. Again, at the time, full support of the American people, enduring partisan and congressional support. Here we face a challenge in regard to Ukraine. And maybe I can ask you both by means of a final question. What needs to happen for public support for Ukraine on both sides of the Atlantic to remain solid? Maybe, Bob, you want to start and then we'll go to Heather.
Yeah, I think it's a really good one. We've noticed over the last weeks that the public and also the media, they can't deal with more than one or two major crises at the same time. So when Gaza happened, of course, attention went away from Ukraine. But very soon after, you also see the support slipping. I think one thing that's really important, what we need to do is not only the classic, keep it on the agenda. No, we need to have a better story on how we want this to end. I think I fully agree with Heather. If the public thinks that this is an infinite war, that we have no chance because Russia is anyway going to produce more weapons than we ever can, we talk ourselves into some sort of defeatist mindset. And Russia is enjoying this greatly and will amplify every single message that it can. I think a couple of things Heather said are really important. One is self-confidence. Don't be too afraid. We've done a scenario exercise on possible futures of Russia. People were afraid of pretty much every scenario that we produced. It's not going to be pretty in any way, but we just need to take this very soberly and be prepared and be honest about it. And also towards the Ukrainians, we need to be honest and we need to give Ukrainians a chance to keep also telling their stories. Because they are very powerful stories. It was good that President Zelensky was in Washington, even if the receipt that he got was not the same as he had last time. Same should be here. We should keep listening also to Ukrainians, because the worst that we can do, and unfortunately I've been in this line of work also for a while, I remember us forgetting about Ukraine after 2015. Right? This war has been actually going on for a decade, not 2 years. And that's the worst that can happen to Ukrainians, that we just forget the conflict. There's just one of those things happening in the background. Well, Russia is not going to go away. Thank you.
Heather. Yeah, thank you. 3 points. GMF is actually, we're really living history. We just started 2 weeks ago. We're going on a whistle-stop tour for Ukraine. We're touring the country, the heartland, agricultural communities, helping people understand why Ukraine's support is important for U.S. Economic prosperity and for security. You have to help people understand why this support is important. And then I like to add the consequences if Ukraine is not successful. So we all have to do this, and it seems enormous, but we have to get started. And we're partnering. GMF is partnering with the Howard G. Buffett Foundation in order to do that. And Howard Buffett's doing amazing work to revitalize Ukrainian agriculture. So, we have to start somewhere. We're going back to our roots. Second, this is where you're absolutely right, Bob. I mean, obviously, the extraordinary events unfolding after October the 7th pull us in the Middle East as well. But here's the thing, and this is what we also remind people, there is an alignment of adversaries of the West. So Russia is investing in Iran's missile technology and capability. Iran is selling drones and missiles for Russia for use in Ukraine. North Korea and selling munitions, and China is supportive of all of that. So these theaters are connected. We don't have the luxury of choosing the threat that we think is the most. They are now aligned, and this is where I hope NATO next year really has to understand how NATO interacts with that adversarial alignment. How will this story end? Could not emphasize this, but we have to have a winning mindset. We have to have a vision of winning that provides the hope that a better day is tomorrow. But just to get back to our NATO and EU conversation, if Ukraine is unsuccessful, Ukrainians will be in NATO and the European Union, but there will be millions of Ukrainians in NATO and EU countries if they will migrate there because their country will be occupied and devastated if Ukraine is not successful. These are the choices. These are the consequences. The cost, while high now, is so less in what the cost will be if Ukraine fails. This is why leaders with a winning mindset and understanding why We have to reinforce the enormous human economic costs if Ukraine is unsuccessful. They are fighting for our freedom. We have to support them. They're not asking us to fight for them. But without support, this is going to fall on NATO borders fairly quickly, and that will be massively destabilizing. So we have a huge job to do. The Marshall Plan, 1947 to 1949, told us we can do it. We can do this again. It takes political leadership and a message of hope to the Ukrainian people that they will make it through this winter. It's going to be very, very challenging, however.
Thank you so much, Heather Conley in Washington, Bob Deen here in The Hague. Thank you.
Thank you.